to Season 3 of Mindset Monday. My co-host, Dr. Chandra, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist from MGH Chelsea Healthcare Center, and I are back with another season of exciting speakers. Started in 2020, this podcast series aims to inform and enrich us all with unique perspectives and mindsets on different topics and allows us to grow as individuals and expand our own mindsets. In today's episode, considering the challenging landscape of mental illnesses, we explore mindset on social pathologies with our fabulous guest speaker. Professor Young Godley is a lecturer at Dartmouth College in the writing program and has taught Writing 2, Screen and Life, Writing 5, Metamorphosis and Otherness, Thinking Metaphorically, and first-year seminar, Cultures of Self-Loathing. She was an undergraduate valedictorian at Ewha University, earned her master's degree at Seoul National University, and received her PhD in English from the University of Buffalo as a Fulbright Scholar. She published The Feminization of Translation, Gender Politics in the Translation Controversy over Han, Kang's the Vegetarian, with Meridian's Feminism, Race, Transnationalism at Duke University Press, and co-translated Robert P. Waxler's The Risk of Reading to Korean. Her research interest involves analyzing conflicts of race, gender, and disability within marginalized communities through literature and theory. So the topic of our podcast today is really complex, and I think a good starting point is to discuss the themes in Professor Godley's course, Cultures of Self-Loathing. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Professor Godley earlier this year and taking this course as my first-year seminar at Dartmouth. And initially I picked the course because the title was very intriguing, and as someone championing the growth mindset and positivity for so many years, I was interested in learning about how we might antagonize negative feelings and emotions we experience that we view as challenges to living successful lives, and how they actually might manifest at a cultural level. Welcome, Professor Godley.
Thank you so much, Sachi and Dr. Chandra, for having me here. It's truly an honor. So I'll just talk a little bit about my background and the course. So I was the so-called third culture kid from South Korea and the United States back in the 90s. That just means I, spent my childhood and school years in a different country from my parent culture without immigration. And that experience was interesting because I was basically growing up with being labeled as other in both countries, having that kind of homelessness at your own home, whichever that means. And that led me to question about certainties of identity, belonging, etc. So naturally, this led to my research topic and questions. And I've always been interested in the question, what holds us together as a community? And if you're a literary scholar in the humanities like me, that actually means you're looking at the opposite, the difficulties of holding a community and the perplexities that comes with it. So Cultures of Self-Loathing was one of the ways I wanted to explore this topic. So it was a seminar not just about the individual, but the community as well.
And, just thinking back to your syllabus, I'm quoting a question that you had, and that was actually the piece that caught my eye when I was reading through the course selection. And it said, what if self-loathing is about more than an individual deficit, and in a sense doesn't even reside in the self? What if it has something to teach us about what we value and can therefore shed light on larger problems in our culture and society that would otherwise go unheeded? And so kind of hearing this, initial motivation for why you designed this course, can you help us understand what you mean by self-loathing?
Yeah, sure. So let me start by saying that a lot of times self-loathing in our culture is pathologized as an individual problem, oftentimes associated with feeling down. So people will say something like, oh, you're self-loathing, you must have low self-esteem. Try to look at the bright side, right? And it's all about individual perspective, or just pick yourself up, fake it until you make it, and then you'll feel better about yourself. And under the positive and affirming rhetoric here, we can see what's lurking inside, which is a problematic, troublesome cultural assumption. So for example, we can read an impatience toward an individual who's not being productive enough due to mental health issues, or we could see an aversion to feeling bad in general, even if that could actually have a possibility of identifying something really important and envisioning change. We could also see a refusal to see societal structural issues that could be at play behind the symptom of self-loathing. And we could also hint a sense of cynicism. So it's not just ignorance, but, well, I can't change the world. I'm just an individual, so I'm just going to focus on myself and so on. And this gets even worse when you look at how our culture wants to treat self-loathing. So on the one hand, we have the self-help industry, the self-help books, social media advices, right? Like you should get out of it as soon as possible. And there's an opposite way of dealing with this also on social media, which is something like romanticizing the struggles that you have. So, oh, this is like something that makes you quirky. It's your character trait. You should keep it. Try not to get rid of it. And both ways that we're thinking about self-loathing here is limited. So I wanted to pose questions about what we're thinking of self-loathing in this manner in our current cultural climate. Is self-loathing an issue of just feeling sad, for example? In what way are we defining the self? And how is the self functioning when we're thinking about self-loathing? And as you can see, there's also this impulse to moralize it immediately. So it's either something good or bad. And what are the limitations if we're just going to do that quickly and move on? And finally, what does the current discourse on self-loathing prevent us from recognizing problems that actually go beyond the individual? So what I think of self-loathing, I think it's something like wanting to make a demand of society, but it's prevented or actually really hard to articulate that demand because your desire is entangled with it. So I'll just give a simple example. Let's say there's a student who's not getting good grades in school, in class, and she's self-loathing. She feels like she's worthless. She's not worth her parents' investments. She's guilty. She feels like she's never going to go to college. She might not even get a job with benefits and so on and so forth. It goes on and on and on. On the one hand, we can tell the student to say, look, it's just one class. Your fate isn't sealed yet. You're kind of resentful of all these students getting ahead. Guess what? You'll actually win in the end. We can do that. But in her self-loathing, we can also read a different kind of desire, which is something like maybe we shouldn't treat human life based on income, profession, worthiness based on that, worth the investment rhetoric. Maybe we should say people should get more than one chances, way more chances. And one, bad grade or whatever shouldn't seal anyone's faith for that matter. Maybe everyone should have benefits, health insurance, and so on. So there's a desire to win the game and ace the system. And that's why that person who's self-loathing struggles to get to that level of demand, but it's there. So I think it's important to not shame self-loathing immediately, but try to read the multiple desires so that we can make meaningful change.
So it sounds like, people's expectations very much factor in, what it is that they are seeking, whether they're able to accomplish it, and how they feel about it. But I love your point that a lot depends on the messages we're getting from society about what we should be doing, about what level we should be reaching, and then, how we cope with the demands of, with sort of our talent level, our achievement level, and, how it compares to what society expects from us. That's it.
Yeah, I remember having a discussion with the rest of the class, and we had talked about, as students feeling this pressure of even getting into colleges and the feeling of it was almost like you were being pitted against one another, even though college is a place to explore and be curious and have all these new intellectual discoveries, but rather we were like marketing ourselves as a product to a college as an application, and trying to think of the best ways that, you know, we could present ourselves, and if we felt it wasn't as good as it should be, that how that might worsen how we felt about ourselves. And so trying to pinpoint are those feelings that we're getting of feeling like you're not good enough for a school, or maybe not getting into a school that you want, is that a product of, you know, something that's wrong with yourself, or maybe at a cultural level, you know, what are colleges expecting of students, and what are they prioritizing in the students that they're selecting? And so I really like the way that you not only look at it from the self, but also, and the individual, but also at a cultural and a community level, to be challenging some of those things and pinpointing where those feelings come from. And so during our class sessions, we also read excerpts from Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism and discussed how cruel attachments might worsen these feelings of self-loathing. So can you expand on what cruel attachments are and what makes them cruel?
Sure. And I think this relates directly to what Dr. Chandra said about expectations earlier. So the key to understanding cruel optimism or cruel attachments is to start by recognizing that we all have attachments, and attachments are by definition optimistic, because that's what keeps you going. You think you can build something out of it, and you have a sense of self almost. You build your identity around it. You understand the world through that kind of attachment. And the thing is, what happens when something that you attached yourself onto betrays you and says, you know, everything that you hope for so far, or, you know, the identity that you build around it is going to be no more. Can you just simply say, oh, well, you know, let's cut our losses and move on? Not really. So Berlant is saying here, there's a way cruel optimism, a relation of cruel optimism emerges in these kind of situations. Because people can't really easily let go, because letting that go means jeopardizing the sense of self and also how they understand the world and so on. So instead of letting go, they try to desperately get back to the system that it actively kicked you out. And it's a real betrayal, because if you think about it, when you have an attachment of an idea of a good life, for example, it's not a daydream-like unattainable fantasy, but it was something that you truly believed it could be your future, and you've been working hard towards it. And once that betrayal happens and you can't move on, you effectively know this is not working. You don't have that optimism anymore, and that's what makes it so cruel. And your desire for optimism itself could also be another form of a new object of desire that you want to attach yourself to. So if you're in this cycle of cruel optimism and cruel attachments, that means you're in an endless state of suffering, basically. And it's easy for you to self-loathe in these situations because you affectively know this isn't working, yet you somehow chose to be in this, right? So you can have these oppressive thoughts toward yourself. Yes, this sucks, but it was my decision, although it didn't seem like I had a choice, and so on and so forth. What I want to say in that kind of situation, and this could come from yourself, but also from your friends and family members, they could actually say the same thing to you in that situation. Berlant was mapping out the relations of cruel optimism, but that was never about shaming individuals who are trapped in that cycle. It was always about holding the world accountable when they were giving us objects, giving us dreams for us to attach to that is not going to work, that is going to betray us, that is going to exploit us in the end. So remembering her project as demanding better objects for us to attach ourselves to is really important, so we don't immediately shift the blame to ourselves.
Can I just comment? I love your points. You know, I work with an Asian student mental health center at Mass General Hospital, and one thing we counsel parents on is not to expect their kids to put all their eggs in the academic basket, to make sure that kids have friends, to make sure kids, are doing community service and other things that make them feel good about themselves, because academic success is not guaranteed at every level. So, a teenager who's doing well at the high school level may struggle if they get into a very good college. I spoke at Harvard College in 2011. Actually, I sort of led a group, and students who had been stars in high school were now saying, I'm a below average student here, and I don't know who I am anymore. That their identity had really kind of fragmented because they were considered the smart kid in high school, but now they were less than in college. And now who are they? So the whole, putting too many eggs in one basket, attaching to one thing, does risk one's self-esteem if something goes badly, or if the payoff is not what we expect. Likewise, Tal Ben-Shahar, who taught a course at Harvard called, I believe, Happier, or he wrote a book called Happier. The first anecdote in the book is about his being an under 16 squash player in Israel and wanting to win the championship, the under 16 championship. He trains and competes in the tournament and wins. And he's surprised. He's like, I thought the payoff, I thought I would feel really happy after this, but I don't really feel that much at all. And realize, the journey is really important, and that we also need to we need to understand what we think will make us happy, because it sometimes does not. So I love your point about attachments, goal attachments, because we are sometimes fed messages by society about what will make us happy. We follow this path, this yellow brick road, we'll reach the wizard, and something fantastic is going to happen. We're going to just be at the peak. But that's not always the case. Messages we're fed by society or by our friends or by ourselves, can lead us to expectations, which then, if we're not met, can really lead us into despair. So I love your points.
Great insights from both. And I really wanted to help define cruel attachments for viewers, because I think it's a really important segue into our next topic, social pathology. So another piece that we read from class was Byung-Chul Han's Burnout Society, in which Han theorizes how the violence of positivity and achievement society contributes to a form of self-exploitation in which we're overworked and exhausted under this paradox of achievement and becoming this best version of ourselves. And so thinking about how this achievement society is a cruel object for us, can you talk about how feelings of self-loathing might stem from achievement society and how we might have cruel attachments to this culture?
Sure. Let me just begin by saying, when Byung-Chul Han is talking about the violence of positivity, he's identifying a paradigm shift of societal violence. So in the 20th century, the violence of society mainly focused on excluding the other and from a demarcated boundary. So this other could be someone outside of a given system, so the alien or the foreign, or it could be someone within as well, someone who violated the law or prohibition. So this could be something like criminals, madmen, and so on and so forth. And Byung-Chul Han says we don't live in a world that's so outwardly hostile anymore, but that doesn't mean we're living in a pacified society. We're actually living in a different kind of violence. So instead of the violence of negativity and the Foucauldian discipline society, which means the whole rule was basically saying you can't do this, you should not do this, and you have to follow those external restraints, something different happened. So the violence of positivity, or not having that external negativity, means we're living in a world where it's hypersaturating what is already imminent in the system, and that is actually causing violence and problems to ourselves. So this is really really disturbing and tricky, because that means we seem like we're more free from these external constraints, no more discipline, no more otherness, and so on. But we're actually feeling more free, and because of that, we are being more exploited in the system. And that is where the overworked, overachieved subject actually happens, and this is where we are, the so-called achievement society. So think of an entrepreneur as an example in a gig economy. This person, Byung-Chul Han calls the achievement subject. So he is self-motivated, self-driven. He can control his time. He doesn't really have a boss, right? And there's this idea that the sky's the limit in terms of the income. If I work harder, I can generate infinite amount of income. That's the fantasy, right? And what's happening in that situation is that the exploited and the person who's exploiting and the one who's being exploited is actually mushed into one. And overproduction and overachievement becomes the norm because people won't have that much of a problem with it because they feel more free. They feel this is a better situation. And meanwhile, because everyone's overproducing and overachieving, they're too busy to stop and think or be outraged at unjust situations. And they end up burnout after being in this kind of cycle. And they end up being either self-loathing depressives or quote unquote losers in the eyes of society. So to link it to cruel attachment, as you pointed out, Sachi, it's really easy for us to attach to this idea of, oh, do what you love. Like, don't listen to anyone else. Like, listen to yourself, have control over your time and income and so on and so forth. It sounds really positive, right? And that's why it's easy for us to attach ourselves to that idea in the first place. So it's actually that attachment, the cruel attachment, that makes the dynamic of exploitation happen, which has really interesting implications when we're thinking about self-loathing and how to work with this problem in our current culture. Because if there's a self-loathing that's coming from excessive positivity, this kind of toxic positivity and achievements, that logically suggests that you can't fight self-loathing with being positive or achieving more, because that's actually part of the puzzle piece that's making the self-loathing happen.
Can I add to that? This is an excellent point as well about how how people get exploited. Workplaces are often, said to be families. We're like family here. And, more and more is put in the workplace. In large companies, the buildings may have gyms or massages available or, kitchens, so that people are encouraged to spend a lot of time there, and everything you need is there, so that you can do your work. So people may work late in the evenings because, this is like home. But then they're just not feeling very satisfied and unsure why. And, I think as humans, we need positive relationships to be happy. We need good relationships with, with friends, with family, with our community. And the more time that's taken away from that and put into work, the more leisure time is taken away, the less happy we tend to be. But we may not understand why, because like you're saying, things are framed as being positive for you. So why would you be unhappy? And it must be something wrong. I need to just work harder or really lean in more to this family culture and really make, just be closer to my colleagues. But then it's just not the right direction, and we're not sure why. So you're sort of in a Sisyphean situation where you're rolling the rock up the hill and it comes back down. You're like, oh, that's funny. Maybe I just need to roll it harder so I can get up the hill. And then you just keep trying, but things are not working. You're not sure why. But your point about framing is wonderful. That Uber drivers may be like, wow, I can make so much money, but then where are my health benefits coming from? I have to pay for those. So, we are, in a sense, exploited without knowing. So, your overall message about ideas coming from society, which get into our minds and then, have us act in certain ways which are not always adaptive or not always good for us. Really great points. Thank you.
Oh, and I just wanted to add, I love that point about the Sisyphean rock falling down, and we're thinking, oh, that's odd, let's try again. I think that's perfect.
And, one really impactful reading that I felt really touched upon this as well from class was Tell Me It's Going to Be Okay by Mia Tokumitsu that you assigned. And here's a little quote from there. Employers, corporations hungrily eyeing public assets determined to alienate us from each other in the interest of marketizing our souls for their own benefit. In return, they bestowed to us a self-oriented language of supposed care that was never really meant to liberate us from the sources of our anxiety and depression. It's only there to blunt the pain temporarily, long enough to enable us to move on to the next TaskRabbit assignment, Uber client, or briskly managed election cycle. And so, something I had really never thought about before taking your class was neoliberalism. And after taking your class, it was a new vocab word for me, and it took some time to kind of sit. And honestly, I'm not really sure I still don't know exactly what it is, but for our viewers, can you kind of explain what neoliberalism means in the context of social pathology?
Sure. I'm going to start by saying, Sachi, you were not alone. A lot of my students actually had to look up neoliberalism, either because they never heard of it or they heard of it somewhere, but they couldn't really define it with their own words. And I think that really speaks to the pervasiveness of neoliberalism. It's not in our everyday vocabulary. And because of that, it's really hard to recognize it as an ideology. And it sometimes feels as if that's the way things are, that's what human nature is all about, and so on and so forth. Something neutral, something that shouldn't be questioned. And that's why it's so powerful, and that's why it's really important to think about this. So under neoliberalism, you're basically a precarious subject. You're not really a bearer of political rights. You're not someone with a community, but you're basically on your own, and you're in competition the whole time. So Miya Tokumitsu brings up this example of the star rating system. So usually when we have numbers and units attached to it, it has a agreed upon meaning. This is measuring, this unit. But for the star system, no one really knows. But it does have meaning once you start comparing the stars to someone else. So that's kind of like the crux of like neoliberal ideology. You are in constant competition with one another. It's a fluctuating hierarchy. No one really knows what it means, but that's the way things are, or that's what it seems like. And because you're always in this competition mode, you can't really have a community or friendship or this kind of comradeship, because they're your enemies basically. And because of that, you end up being alone. You end up feeling isolated, alienated. And the thing is, this is where neoliberalism also gives you some sort of forced therapy, according to Tokumitsu. So neoliberalism will actually capitalize on that. It's not a therapy that's out there to treat the core of your anxiety, but it's there to make you feel good. So it's something like, oh, you're anxious because you can get laid off at any given moment. Not to worry, our business offers wellness programs, yoga classes, self-care workshops, and so on, right? Yeah, so it's not there to treat the core cause of that precariousness or lacking a sense of community. Tokumitsu also brings up an example from 2016 when Lyft published an article basically saying this is an exciting story that everyone should share, something similar, which was about a pregnant woman who was in labor, but on her way to the hospital, she actually took a client. So she was working. So if that's framed as an exciting story that we're somehow, that's inspirational and positive, but somehow we're also invited to one-up it in a way, and share like I've done this too. We're supposed to admire her as a trooper, but also treat it with a certain kind of competition mode. Like I have another story too, and we're not really supposed to ask those questions about what Dr. Chandra just said about like health insurance or benefits. Why does this person have to work when she's in labor, and so on. So even the most horrific incidents are turned into something really positive, appealing, that you should actually try to win in this perverse way. And you can see this is another form of the violence of positivity we talked about earlier, because it's a tool that corporations use, basically to keep the steam out. Like, you don't want people to get outraged about the situation, and they ultimately want to prevent revolutionary action. So here's another example of the violence positivity can have.
And to echo that, you again bring up such meaningful points about what we're experiencing as society. I have a family member who, confided a week ago. He said, I have a meeting with my boss on Monday, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get laid off. I don't know. There have been layoffs at my company, and you never know who it's going to strike. And they say it might be performance based, may not be. But it seems like at this point, decisions are made at the top that affect a lot of people, and you don't know who in the room is making those decisions, whether it'll affect you. So to bring up another kind of Greek image, the sword of Damocles. There was a king named Damocles who had a sword hanging by a thread over his head. So the point of the sword was going right down to his head. And, and the point was, he said, people want to be king. People want to be me, but you have a sword hanging over your head. So would you really want to trade places? You never know what's going to happen. And I think people who are in the workplace often do feel this chill, like someone close to me got laid off a few weeks ago, and how do I know it won't be me? I don't trust the decision makers. I mean, they may decide my salary is worth cutting. And if they cut my salary, then they, get more money at the top, and the shareholders get more money. So if they're, quote, trimming the fat, then, I may be the next to go. I don't know. And as you said, it can breed a competition, or at least, reduce collegiality within the workplace and alienate people from each other. So another example of how as society we're sort of getting more atomized, moving apart from each other rather than building community and, strengthening the social fabric.
Absolutely. And I think something that does also feel really troublesome about this is it feels like it's capitalizing on us from younger ages. Like, from the time that we're in school, when we're learning, when things are very grade-based and you're being constantly compared to your peers in terms of academic achievement and performance. And then when you go to college and thinking about how you're spending your time, and are you maximizing every minute of your day to be productive and to feeling this idea of I'm more inefficient than this person. Like, I need to improve that within myself, and then, making it feel like it's an individual deficit rather than a cultural problem. And I think that's really, it's helping me understand in context of what neoliberalism means. And so, when thinking about these social pathologies, it can really feel impossible to find a solution. And so part of the culminating research paper in our class was choosing a specific problem related to self-loathing and offering a new perspective or even a proposed solution. And I really liked that because some of the topics are heavy and, it's hard to think about all these problems and then cut it off there. We want to think about what are some next steps. And so I really liked that you made that a point. And so do you have any suggestions for how our Mindset Monday audience can better recognize social pathologies? And how do you suggest that we might view the self and work with negative emotions that inevitably arise in life?
Sure. So I think there was a common thread in this talk today when we were talking about cruel optimism and then the violence of positivity and neoliberal therapy, which is you can't really accept the solutions that are given to you as, proper treatment for the problems that we see today. So questioning these remedies, questioning sometimes the question of the time or the generation or our culture, questioning those two is at the heart of critical thinking. And that was what I was trying to help with my students in this class and the research project. And I would like to expand that to the audience for Mindset Monday. So this is going to be mixed with the theme of self-loathing, and I'll tell you why. One of the comments made in class really haunted me, and I don't know, Sachi, if you remember this. There was a student who told us that thinking often leads to self-loathing. And this was not just because if you keep thinking, you get into this chain down the memory lane and you find something embarrassing. It wasn't really like that, but it was because thinking was always introduced in a form of punishment when you were young. So it's like, oh, go to your room and think about what you did, or here's the thinking chair treatment. So all very early on in our lives, thinking is introduced in association with guilt and self-loathing and being self-critical. And I think that's why thinking is a little, could be a little scary at times. I think that's also part of the reason we might be exposed to all these stimuli by our will. Instead of, just walking in the streets, we need to read something, listen to something, and so on and so forth. But this is also where critical thinking and self-loathing kind of acts together, I think, because if thinking can really, shook you up and unstiffen something that you believe about yourself or the way things are, that's also what critical thinking is going to do. So it's not really going to be necessarily a breeze of like rainbows and unicorns kind of experience when you're trying to think things through. You encounter a moment of self-loathing because let's be real, no one has a safe distance from negative feelings, ugly feelings. All of the things that we talked about, self-loathing or having cruel attachments, trying to think overachievement is the answer, and so on. We're going to, we're not just looking at something and say, look, there's the problem, but it's always related to our everyday lives. So even if you feel fine right now, it is also possible, and this is not a curse, it's also possible you may be ambushed by those feelings at one point. And I'm borrowing this term from George Yancey, where he says ambush is not really the end, but it's a beginning. It's a potentiality where you can actually think of changing. So it's not the fact that you have those emotions that's going to be a final judgment on your character, for example. But it's where analysis starts. So if you're thinking through solutions, or if you are suffering from self-loathing, that's a point of departure. Try to analyze it and question some of the things that seem obvious and see where that takes you. I think that will be the suggestion that I would like to make here.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think one needs to question. It may lead to cognitive dissonance, may lead to disorientation, but ultimately you may come out the other side saying, I see how I've been kind of scripted, and the script, was not good for me. And now I can sort of look at these messages and say, that's where that message came from. When I was in college, there was a magazine called Adbusters, which may still be around. And it took photos of ads and pointed at them, pointed at aspects of them. Says they're trying to make you believe that if you buy our product, that you're going to be, that you're going to more easily get a romantic partner, or they're trying to point out that this is going to increase your social status, and here's how they're doing it. So it helped you recognize that, I think it was subtitled Adbusters, Journal of the Mental Environment. And it was kind of how ads are getting in your head and trying to convince you to buy their product, and it's going to increase social status, it's going to help you get a romantic partner, it's going to make you happy. And these are the kinds of messages we also get, you're saying, from corporations, from the media. And the media is often controlled by a small number of corporations. So you have a lot of forces trying to convince you of certain things. And if you are becoming unhappy, if you are experiencing negative feelings about yourself, self-loathing, then where is that coming from? Some negative feelings are normal, as you said. You're going to have them going through life: frustration, boredom, anger with people, sadness, anxiety about the future. But the ones that we're getting from others, we have to look at them carefully. The messages we're getting from others, and how they're making us feel, we have to look at carefully. And we often don't do that. We just swim with the stream. But if the stream is going the wrong way, if we feel like we're kind of in a current that is, onrushing and leading us somewhere concerning, we have to find a way to swim against it. We have to get to shore and make sense of it, and then figure out what we want to do. So even though it is disorienting, it may cause cognitive dissonance, we have to look at these messages. And, I think Sachi, when she took your class, was just really struck by the idea of neoliberalism and, what it has created in our society. So thanks for that.
Absolutely. Really good insights from you both. And I think something, that when I took your class, a lot of the readings that we did, I had to sit with them. And, as a college student, you don't want to sit with your readings for class. I mean, there's so many assignments. You want to finish it, check it off the task list, next assignment. And I felt like with your readings, it wasn't even that it was, I didn't have time, but I wanted to sit and think because they were difficult, they were challenging, they made me question things that I already knew. And I think another thing for viewers to do from this episode is possibly look through some of the readings that you did assign. I really thought they impacted me, and I'm still wrestling with the ideas in it. It definitely takes more than one read. But out of all of the pieces that you selected for the syllabus, which piece was the most intellectually exciting, if you could pick one, and why might you recommend it to viewers?
So this was a hard question. But I find myself going back to Universality and Identity Politics by Todd McGowan. So I'm going to pick that one for this particular question. And it's really fascinating because it relates also to what Dr. Chandra just said about this is scripted, because he's going to ask whether identity is also scripted. Are we playing a certain part, or are we enjoying ourselves? And that's a really difficult question for us to ask. So let me just contextualize what I just meant by that. We talked about how focusing on just feeling good to treat our sense of self-loathing or alienation can actually prevent ourselves from envisioning meaningful change. Can identity, diversity, and mutual tolerance be one of them too? And I think our instant reaction is to say, no, those are good. We should not question those. But McGowan actually goes further and analyzes why we have that reaction to begin with, and what may be missing as a result. So McGowan talks about how in our recent times, universality has basically a bad rep because it's associated with like oppression, mastery, violence, not respecting diversity. Since much of the horrors of the 20th century evoke the universal under the name of the universal. But what McGowan writes convincingly in this book is that was never universal. They claimed to be universal, but it was only to benefit a chosen few, a particular few. So it was actually more of a particularism. But without recognizing that, we abandoned universality really quickly. And we also started to think this is what universality is, this is what it looks like. And we start to celebrate particular identities, but without a universality, a universal emancipation in our minds. And that's a problem. McGowan exposes that there's a way we enjoy our identities and the sense of belonging that comes with them. But there are perils of identity politics, especially when we lose sight of the universal. I'll just stop there so everyone can check out the book on their own. There's so many things to talk about in this book, I know. But it's a great book because it really helps us practice that critical thinking, to really critically examine where we are in culture and politics and how we understand our own selves.
That's beautifully pointed out. At MGH Chelsea, where I work with a number of Bosnian refugees. So they fled the Bosnian War in the 90s. And one point that the refugees consistently made was that they said, we were happy under Marshal Tito, socialist society. We were happy. We didn't know what our neighbors' backgrounds were. We didn't care what their religion was. We just felt close to each other. We had a strong community. And then Milosevic came in, and then we were told, you are a Croatian Catholic, and that Bosnian Muslim is your enemy. This person is Serbian Orthodox. They're your enemy. So religious leaders started to fragment the community and say, and tell people this is your identity and this is who you should fight against. And slowly people started to look at their neighbors and say, that person, actually, I need to be against that person. And communities started to attack each other, and the war started. But my patients tell me, they said, we were fine before this until identity politics came in, and then we were pitted against each other. And so the pitting against each other is in the interest of, like you're saying, the few. It's in the interest of the few to pit people against each other so that we can continue to be productive and they can maintain their power, their hegemony. So it is problematic if we are able to. Of course, we have our identities, but if we are able to see each other, as human, as having a lot in common, we can build community. We can overcome differences rather than look at each other as like, well, let me see how I can put this person in a box and how are they different from me and separate from me and other. So instead, we can find commonalities and join with them and enjoy life together.
Fabulous points. So just taking a look at the time, I want to thank you both so much for speaking and providing your insights into such a complex topic. And I really feel that you both touched upon some of the major points that I was intrigued through this topic from. And I also just think that viewers are going to find so much richness in some of the readings, and I'll link those below in the video. But I want to thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you, Sachi, Dr.